Hello, Laura. How are you?
Nice to see you.
Good to see you as well. Danny, hey, Joanna, you doing well?
I'm okay. I need to write a little bit more, so those are the first 5. I'll be spitting them out.
Okay, right on.
I think I have one change.
Okay.
Get a pen there.
Uh-huh.
Look, thank you, Madam. I only see you at these sorts of things.
I am hoping to get out a little bit more now, but thank you for asking me to have this one. Yeah. Remember what humans look like?
I don't get out that much either, except at work.
Good, how are you? Well, I've seen you all over the place, but not for real.
Just gonna make sure this. Okay, so then. Essential that the social and economic supports for individuals, families, and businesses that have been impacted as a result. I think so, yeah, I would agree. Yes.
Yeah, she treated me in the emergency room. Long. So I assume I'm one of thousands.
And let's reopen.
How are you? Good. I should have practiced doing this with my mask on. Are we doing this with no mask? We cannot be doing this. 6 while we're here. That works. Certainly will be.
Hello.
Mask. Snapping away.
Feel like I'm in high school.
territory. Yeah, it's hard to get to.
Makes me wonder how I was feeling when I was still. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Read a bit more.
I parented more.
Just to give everybody the 3-minute mark.
Okay. We are getting underway in 3 minutes. Yeah.
They used to sit right up next to the teacher's desk.
Good evening. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all those joining us from across the territory for this federal election All Candidates Forum on Yukon First Nations election issues, hosted by the Council of Yukon First Nations. Shangklein aniji again not nashindi tagish katine esh denista denek e koshe eshachlan eshma tan kwechan tagish kuchane eshachlan eshta kuchan eshaguna dakhluadiate Joete Shiendi Eshma Jura. My name is Christine Genier. I will be your moderator this evening. I am a woman of the Wolf Clan of the Tagish Tlingit and European people. I am a citizen of the Cohen Council, broadcaster, journalist, and language and culture keeper, and happy to be your moderator this evening. I am based here in Whitehorse. We are broadcasting live this evening from the Kwanlin Dun Cultural Centre on the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun First Nations and Cohen Council. In addition to the audience members joining us in person this evening at the Cultural Centre, we are providing several options for audiences to join us remotely this evening. We have a Zoom virtual meeting space. CYFN is broadcasting on Facebook Live, and Shone FM is also broadcasting live across the territory, 98.1 in Whitehorse, 90.5 in the communities. Each of the candidates vying to become Yukon's Member of Parliament are in attendance here this evening. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Barbara Dunlop, Conservative Party of Canada; Brendan Hanley, Liberal Party of Canada; Lenore Morris, Green Party of Canada; Jonas Smith, Independent; Lisa Valenzuela, New Democratic Party. Our agenda for this evening is as follows. We'll begin with an opening prayer and a brief introduction by each candidate. We will then move into a series of pre-formed questions for the candidates. During that time, audience members may submit their questions. Audience questions will then be asked during the second half following a short break. Audience questions can be provided to our team in a couple of ways. We can take them by telephone at 867-322-4695, extension 802. If you are tuning in through Zoom, in the Zoom webinar by entering the question in the chat box, or on the Facebook Live feed by entering the question as a comment. We also have a limited audience of guests joining us in person that are welcome to submit questions to our team using the provided note cards and pens in the viewing area. Our team will then compile the questions and select audience questions to ask to the candidates from those contributed by audience members. I've been asked to deliver an opening prayer, and I will be doing that in the Tagish language. Eshma, thank you to my mother for helping me recapture this language. Ayet ejan desi, ayet emachi kusat, quishro udze zigli. Se danish sa eshni eshnu shindi danish sa sho eshnu shindi koshe sho so et eshindi so et eshindi so et eshindi. Shonithan, thank you. And now we would like to give the candidates, thank you. We'd like to give the candidates, each of the candidates, the floor to provide brief opening remarks and to introduce themselves, starting with Barbara Dunlop, Conservative Party of Canada, and then we will move clockwise. We've got 3 minutes for each candidate. Barbara?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here on the traditional territory of Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Cohen Council. Thank you to CYFN and to the Grand Chief for your generous invitation. And thanks to everyone who's joining us here in person or through the radio and social media for taking the time to be here with us. I'm Barbara Dunlop, the Conservative Party candidate. This election was called during an extraordinary time. COVID has had a profound effect on families, First Nations, and communities. Our economic security has been threatened, and our mental wellness has been impacted. Our sense of community has been profoundly disrupted as we tried to keep each other safe and protect our children and our frontline healthcare workers. And now we're trying to chart a new path forward while still overcoming worry, isolation, and in some cases, tragedy. I believe we need to approach this challenging time together with respect and with patience, listening closely to the perspectives and concerns of community members. I understand that I'm a new face for some, I understand that it will take time to build relationships and trust, and I very much appreciate this opportunity to listen and speak with you tonight. During the campaign, I've had a few opportunities to hear the views of First Nations citizens and community members. They were very generous with their time and very thoughtful in sharing their stories. I've heard concerns ranging from critical housing shortages to healthcare access in communities, community infrastructure, and economic development. I'm encouraged by what I've read in the Conservative Party platform. I see tremendous opportunities for Yukon and for the North. But what's very clear to me is I've only scratched the surface on the issues and challenges facing First Nations, individual citizens, and communities. I need to hear more. I need to improve my understanding of the issues and their impacts on the ground so we can work together to frame solutions for communities and for the Yukon. I'm looking forward to listening and learning here tonight. I'm looking forward to a respectful discussion. And again, thank you for inviting me to participate.
Thank you. We are going to go next to the Green Party of Canada, Lenore Morris.
Thank you for everyone who is either here attending today or who's watching online. I'm grateful for everyone's participation in this democratic exercise. I'll start out by acknowledging that I live and work in the traditional territory of the Cohen First Nation and the Cohen Council. So I'm the candidate, Lenore Morris, candidate for the Green Party of Canada. I was also the candidate in 2019, so some people will remember me from then. I like to think that that shows that I'm not a quitter. I'm back here in the game. I've been involved with the Green Party for a long time, and I still feel very strongly, very passionately about the things that the Green Party stands for. They have a strong platform, and they have a strong platform in particular with respect to reconciliation with First Nations. So I'm a Yukoner. I live here in Whitehorse. I've been here for coming up to 22 years. But my roots date back much farther than that, both farther geographically and farther time-wise. I moved to Dawson City when I was a teenager, and I graduated from high school at Roberts Service School in 1980. So over 40 years ago, long time ago. I'm a lawyer. I practice law. I have my own law practice here in Whitehorse. Today, I went into my office. I practice with two other lawyers, and we have support staff. And today, I went in and grabbed everybody and took them down to the climate change rally that was happening outside the legislature. I'm really happy to see that there's still enthusiasm about that. People are still feeling passionate about that, and also, unfortunately, still feeling dissatisfied by the inaction by our government. I'm a parent. I have two grown-up sons. They're in their 30s. One's living in Dawson City. One's living in Montana. I'm a feminist. So I'm a lawyer, and so my passions are social justice, which I would say particularly extends to Indigenous people here in the Yukon, economic justice, and environmental justice. On economic justice, I'm talking about the serious wealth inequality that has developed, particularly in all of Canada, but definitely here in the Yukon. We're seeing some of it in our housing crisis that we have. There's a huge housing shortage here, but there's also really ridiculously expensive housing here. So I own a home. Lots of people do. The truth is I've made a lot of money on my home, and lots of people have, and there's tons of people can't afford a house, and this is a huge problem that we need to deal with. It's not being dealt with adequately now. The priorities that I named at the beginning of my campaign.
Thank you, Lenore.
Thank you.
Sorry. Next, we will hear from Brendan Hanling, candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Thank you. And let me begin also by acknowledging that we're holding this forum on the traditional territories of the Cohen First Nation and the Cohen Council. And I'd like to acknowledge the other candidates, Barb and Jonas and Lenore and Lisa, for putting their names forward in this election. And especially after these last busy few weeks, I heartily respect anyone who takes that leap into political life. And I hope throughout this forum, you will see that whatever our views, we're all putting our hearts into the same goal of a stronger and more resilient Yukon. And this evening is actually the first time that we have, as candidates, been all in the same room together. I've been a northern physician for over 25 years. My work has been primarily focused in northern, remote, and indigenous populations. The pandemic has turned our lives upside down, and I do believe the Yukon has been well served by the federal Liberal government's response throughout the pandemic. The demonstration of the government having Canadians' backs has truly been there. The pandemic required decisive actions. Federal dollars meant that people could make it through a really hard time when jobs were lost and business revenues drastically curtailed. There was money provided to support additional healthcare needs, to enable daycares to keep running, to help long-term care homes to stay safe, and to sustain small businesses, ultimately to give us a head start in access to vaccines. And now, as we continue to face COVID challenges, we also need to recover, to get back to work, to get back to school safely, get the mental health supports that we need, get back to gathering as we need to gather. And this will take time and money. And there are years of recovery ahead of us. The same goal of bold, decisive action, serious investments will need to be set. And in Canada and in Yukon, we have to work to address simultaneous crises, the reality of climate change that is already causing catastrophic events around the world, an opioid crisis that, despite significant investments at multiple levels, continues to worsen and take Yukon lives. And the need to continue the work of reconciliation is sadly and urgently reflected in the summer's findings of children's unmarked grave sites in BC and Saskatchewan. So I think it's fitting that my chosen themes of reconciliation and climate change and mental health and addictions have resonated at the doorways of Yukoners. And the need for housing overlaps with all three of these areas. Housing that speaks to the specific needs of Indigenous peoples, that is adapted to a changing Arctic, and that offers stability and a fixed address to those facing mental health, substance use challenges. And these are areas that have motivated me to seek election. I've learned a lot, and I know I have a lot to learn yet, but building partnerships and finding solutions has always been part of my approach.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you.
We will hear next from Lisa Valenzuela, candidate with the New Democratic Party of Canada.
Thank you, Christine. I recognize the importance and strength of the 14 Yukon First Nations on whose land we live, work, and learn. And I have the privilege of living and working on the land of the original people, the Tagish-Kwan, and the territories of the Kwanlin-Dun First Nation, Ta'an-Kwachon Council, and Carcross-Tagish First Nation. Like many, I've learned a lot of lessons from my parents. They were quite young when I was born, just teenagers. My mom, Connie, taught me the importance of lifelong learning. She graduated from high school when I was in grade 11, and my brother was in grade 9. She taught me to be brave and to value education, no matter how that looks. My dad, Henry, he worked really hard to support all of us. He worked on the factory line, making Chrysler minivans for 31 years. He got that job 1 week before my mom and dad got married. He taught me the importance of finding meaning and respect in the workplace. I brought these lessons of respect and lifelong learning to youth justice in the territory, supporting youth, their families, and communities. It was in this environment where I recognized the effects of the wrongs that have been done and continue to be done to Indigenous people. Reconciliation has to be more than words. It requires action. We have the roadmap. In partnership with Indigenous peoples, an NDP government will fully implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. Reconciliation includes climate justice. We have all seen the changes in the weather. Elders have told me animals are migrating differently now. And this summer, I had a front row seat to that change. Through the generosity of Yukoners from across the territory, thousands of sandbags were filled to help me and my neighbors as we faced record rising water levels to save our homes. Under the Liberal government, they declared a climate crisis, and the very next day, with your money, purchased a pipeline. Under the Conservatives, we saw the dismantling of scientific resources and the removal of environmental protections. The Conservatives weren't even able to acknowledge the existence of climate change. The NDP will put in place an environmental Bill of Rights. We will end subsidies to oil and gas. We will work in partnership with Indigenous peoples across the country. We will expand the Indigenous Guardians program while upholding Indigenous knowledge. We will implement all 94 calls to action. We are at a turning point in this election. We can choose to support those who do not recognize climate change, those who have repeatedly failed to follow through with their commitments to Indigenous people, or we can choose optimism and the future we want for future generations. That's why I'm running with the NDP.
Thank you, Lisa. And now we will hear from Jonas Smith, Independent.
Thank you, Gwyneth. Merci, Christine, for your prayer. Hello, Dunja, bonjour. My name is Jonas Smith. I'm running as an independent, and I'm very happy to be here on the settlement land of the Kwantlen Dun First Nation. And I think settlement land is very important to acknowledge because that is what sets Yukon First Nations apart from the rest of the country. And in addition to that, this beautiful center, the Cultural Center, which is a centerpiece of our community, this is a product of the final agreement and a great example of what happens when governments work together for the better of all Yukoners. And so we should all be proud. I am running as an independent in this election, not as a Conservative Party candidate, because I am opposed to coercive and discriminatory measures when it comes to COVID vaccine policy. In the Yukon context, the vast majority of our population is vaccinated and protected. In fact, we are among the most vaccinated and protected in the whole world. But the reality is there are still many Yukoners, thousands in fact, many of our friends, family members, a considerable number of Yukon First Nations people, some who are watching home tonight, some who are even in this room with us, who have chosen not to get vaccinated for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to see my neighbors segregated. I believe this country needs less discrimination, not more. So a concept I expect we will be talking about tonight in the First Nations context is one of coercion versus informed consent. And I think that's something we need to talk about more in the vaccine context. We need to be talking about choice. So I'm here to advocate for all Yukoners, whether you're vaccinated or not, and for your choice. And I want to stand up for you, all of you. So I also hope to talk about a number of other important items that are important, especially Yukon First Nations' essential role in addressing some of the other challenges in our territory right now, whether it's our shortage of housing, developing new clean power initiatives, addressing our addictions and mental health challenges in our communities. So I look forward to that discussion tonight, and I hope that I can demonstrate to you that I'm the best candidate to represent you in Ottawa. I like to think that I have not only the experience, but I have demonstrated that I'm willing to stand up for you no matter the costs. So I would like to ask you for support on September 20th. So thank you again. Merci.
Thank you to all of the candidates for their introduction. We will now move into the first part of our agenda where candidates will respond to a series of preformed questions. These questions were informed by input from Yukon First Nations chiefs and youth councils. And some ground rules for the questions. They are as follows. Timekeeping. There is a timekeeper on site. We will be using a lighted countdown clock that will display an amber light when there's 15 seconds left for the response and will blink red when the allocated response time has run out. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to the question. After candidates have responded to the question, each candidate will have the opportunity to provide a follow-up comment of up to 1 minute. I will rotate when calling upon candidates to respond to questions so that each candidate has multiple opportunities to provide first responses. I will begin by asking the series of predetermined questions that were informed by Yukon First Nations chiefs. Audience members, you may begin submitting your questions for the candidates now, and a reminder, you may do so by calling 867-322-4695, extension 802, by typing the question into the chat box in Zoom, or by entering the question as a comment on the Facebook Live feed. In-person audience members can also write and submit their questions to our team. And now for our first question, and it is relating to COVID-19 recovery. We will start with Jonas and move our way toward me. Yukon First Nations have led the way in supporting their communities and citizens through the pandemic. It is essential that the social and economic supports for individuals, families, and businesses that have been impacted as a result of the pandemic are available. Yukon First Nations have had to try and manage the impacts, particularly in the remote communities with limited access to support and services. The impacts are multifaceted and intersecting, such as mental health, increased violence, addictions and substance use, and financial hardships. And here's your question. Please describe your plan for supporting Yukon First Nations through the unique challenges of post-pandemic recovery. And we start with Jonas Smith, Independent.
Well, thanks, Christine. I think the first thing we need to do is safely reopen the economy and make sure that everyone has every possible opportunity to provide for their families. I'm also a big supporter of maintaining programmings for employers so that they can provide the jobs for people affected by the pandemic, specific to rural and remote northern and Indigenous communities. A big part of my platform is training Yukoners to fill Yukon vacancies in communities. I think that if we work with Yukon University, we have a great opportunity to provide trusted care, because quite often we see people from the communities come to Whitehorse for treatment, and they successfully complete it, but they end up back in their home community and unfortunately relapse because they don't have the local support and people they can trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Lisa?
Thank you, Christine. The NDP have a plan to increase broadband and cell service across the territory to remote communities and throughout. We also have, within the first 100 days, within the first 100 days, we will put together an Indigenous national housing strategy with Indigenous partnership, and we are planning to increase mental health supports. I think that all three of these will be of great support through our pandemic recovery, through the COVID recovery. We also will continue supporting businesses and entrepreneurs through wage subsidies and, oh, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And Brendan Henley, you're next.
Thank you. Recovery, as I mentioned in my opening comments, is a huge task ahead of us for everyone, and it does involve, of course, economic recovery. It involves getting people back to work and providing opportunities to work, and it also means addressing many of the issues that have been uncovered or delayed by the effects of the pandemic. Examples are the ongoing mental health needs, which have been exaggerated through the effects of the pandemic, our opioid and toxic drug problem, and the problem that housing creates. So there are many initiatives. One of them being a mental health transfer, a proposed transfer directly to provinces and territories that provides opportunities for improving mental health services, wage supports as well.
Thank you. Lenore Morris?
Since the pandemic started, there's been an enormous amount of government support, and some of that does need to continue. I would say that it could be done in a lot more tailored fashion than it has been, especially early in the pandemic. It seemed like money was just being thrown out into the world. At this point, we've been watching for a long time. I think we can see where the particular industries in particular that need money. I have a son who works in the tourism industry in Dawson City. They've been devastated. They need ongoing support, and probably for several years before it bounces back. Ability to work is a huge thing. Getting our vaccination rate even higher than it is will probably help with that, because people will be able to work safely in their environment. I'm in favor of supporting workers where they are, unless it's looking like some transition is necessary. For some industries, there will be. In the future, I see some real changes.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
The last year and a half has been hard on all Yukoners. With the arrival of the vaccines, we were given hope and for a return to normal. Now that we're moving in a positive direction, we need to listen and to work in partnership with First Nations and communities. We need to continue to keep people safe, both physically and emotionally. We need to ensure programs and supports are appropriate to individual communities. We need to make sure that people are connected and supported by their communities and their families and loved ones. And we need to support small businesses, particularly in the hardest hit sectors like tourism and hospitality. And importantly, we need to continue to take the advice of public health experts.
Thank you. Each candidate will now have 1 minute for follow-up comments, and we will start with NDP candidate Lisa Valenzuela and come back around. Lisa?
Thanks, Christine. We in the NDP also will bring forward a Northern Infrastructure Fund to fast-track investment and focus on improving infrastructure, which may bring in green energy development to communities, which will follow in step with the COVID recovery. And we will provide, we will increase funding to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Brendan Henley?
Hi. Point of order, I'm just not seeing the 15-second warning, but...
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Would I just say then 15 seconds? Okay, if that doesn't feel interrupting at all, I can do that.
Or, yeah,
Okay.
some kind of signal, thanks.
Thank
But
you.
if I can, restart. Yeah, it's almost like picking out of, there are so many parts to recovery. So just one thing to pick out is healthcare and access to rural and remote healthcare. So some of the initiatives are funding to support recruitment, physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, particularly with a rural and Indigenous strategic focus. And another is expanding virtual healthcare services, something which we really discovered and benefited from during this pandemic.
Thank you. Lenore Morris?
I wanted to add that, following up on Lisa's comment, a number of the First Nations have started renewable energy projects in the Yukon, and that's fantastic. Obviously, I commend that, and that's really important work because we are, at this point, we're capped in terms of the amount of energy that's being produced in the Yukon. This is an area that should be a real growth area, and in particular, what we're looking for is energy production in the communities, and that means jobs in the communities.
Thank you. And Barbara Dunlop?
And the Conservative Party is looking at launching a comprehensive COVID vaccination information campaign to help people understand the safety and efficacy of the vaccines and ensure that as many people as possible get vaccinated. And then looking forward as we move into the recovery, we're looking at a significant infrastructure expenditure in the north to undertake broadband and transportation, et cetera, to help the economy get back on its feet.
Thank you. Jonas Smith?
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on my previous points, the tragedy here is I think we've lost more people to addictions and overdoses and suicide than we have to COVID-19 over the last year and a half. And to me, that demonstrates the urgent need that we need to do something because we haven't done enough for them. So I want to ensure that there's no barriers for rural and remote Yukoners, particularly First Nation citizens. And that includes ensuring that vaccine mandates don't prevent them from keeping their government jobs or prevent them from getting on an airplane, for example, to seek treatment outside. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to our second question in the evening, and this is in relation to vaccinations. Yukon First Nations have had access to the COVID vaccine for many months now. We still have a small population who have not been vaccinated due to a variety of reasons. Our question is, what is your position on vaccinations, including mandatory vaccinations and vaccine passports? We are going to start with Liberal Party candidate Brendan Henley.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, just to remind everyone how effective these COVID vaccines are, extraordinarily effective and safe, and I think we have to do everything we can to continue to encourage and give people the right information. I'm also pleased that the Federal Liberal Party is taking a strong stance on vaccination. I know this is troublesome for many, but in order to protect everyone, we need to do everything we can to protect citizens with high rates of vaccine uptake, and we're not quite there. Vaccine policy should always be guided by public health expertise, and I hope we can continue to see that. And I hope that if I were successful, I could help to guide the implementation of vaccine policy at federal level and provide
15.
territories and provinces.
Sorry. Okay, well, we will move on. Thank you, Brendan. We will move on to Green Party of Canada candidate Lenore Morris.
So our party has a policy on that. We aren't in favor of mandatory vaccines. We are in favor of what I'll call limited passports. What I see happening, though, is that a huge amount of public policy is being made in Canada, both at the provincial and territorial level and at the federal level, essentially without any consultation with people, and I find that's a huge problem. Vaccine passports have become an enormous issue in this election, but I don't think that this is the way to solve this complex problem. It seems to me that the federal government in particular is not tailoring its solution to the problem. So the idea that somebody would
15.
lose their job, 15, sorry,
15.
that somebody could be working at Parks Canada as an outdoor maintenance worker and suddenly they have to be vaccinated and they risk losing their job. That's unacceptable. By the same token, here in the Yukon, we've got home care workers who aren't vaccinated.
Thank you. Conservative Party of Canada, Barbara Dunlop.
I believe that vaccines are very important, very safe, and our party is encouraging everyone possible to get the vaccine. We need to protect our frontline healthcare workers. We need to protect our children. We need to protect our teachers. I agree that vaccine mandates are complex and need to be thought through very carefully. It's a different proposition to have someone show vaccine certification to access non-essential services than it is for someone to potentially lose their job over a healthcare decision.
Thank you. Jonas Smith, Independent.
Thank you. I mean, I'm not a doctor, I'm an aspiring politician, so I'm not going to give any medical advice. I encourage anyone with any questions about COVID-19 or their vaccines to talk to their doctor. But I am opposed to mandatory vaccines. I'm opposed to vaccine passports, at least within our own country. In my mind, there's a large difference between encouragement and coercion, and that's what I'm seeing happening right now. I mean, even Dr. Henley, earlier in the pandemic, mentioned that there are going to be people who do not get vaccinated for a variety of reasons, and that everyone needs to be respected for their personal choices. And some of those are medical reasons, some are religious, and some are ethical. I think we need to lead by example and show people the way as opposed to coercion. I think about people in union environments that are being threatened to lose their jobs after 20 years of working towards their pensions or whatnot, people being prevented from travel in their own country. And I think it's also discriminatory to expect people to take daily tests to keep their jobs or to be able to travel.
Thank you. New Democratic Party candidate Lisa Valenzuela-Duke.
Thank you, Christine. Position on vaccines. This is a question that I'm hearing lots at the door. I've been vaccinated, and I encourage others around me to do the same. There's a member of my team who's supporting this, who works in the healthcare profession, frontline, and he's seeing directly the impacts on our healthcare systems, both in human resources as well as in the hospitals and the costs associated with it. It's a reality that you have to be vaccinated in order to enter the hospital in the Yukon right now in Whitehorse, and I think that it's really sad. It's sad for people to die alone, and we're seeing more and more people who are unvaccinated inside hospital and extremely sick. And those who are vaccinated aren't displaying the same symptoms and aren't taking up those resources.
Thank you. Our candidates, of course, have 1 minute for follow-up comments. We will start with Green Party of Canada candidate Lenore Morris.
I've got two things to say. First, There have been violent protests recently, and I want to condemn that right off, whether we're talking about verbal violence or actual physical violence. I'm in favor of protests. I'm absolutely opposed to violence of any kind. I will say, as a lawyer again, this is a charter right, actually, the issues that are at stake here. So there's tons of law on what is an acceptable, what's a legal law. Our charter rights, although they're important, they're not absolute. There has to be, for any law to be legal, there has to be a rational connection between the law and the problem trying to be solved. It has to be minimal impairment of the person's right. And then it has to be a response that's proportionate to the problem. And I would say, particularly with respect to the federal government's proposed sweeping rules around vaccine passports and mandatory vaccines, that it's simply not going to be unconstitutional.
Thank you. We will hear next from Conservative Party of Canada candidate Barbara Dunlop.
I believe that we should continue to follow the advice of healthcare professionals. I am vaccinated. Vaccines are our way out of this pandemic, and they are the way that we get ourselves and our communities back to normal. And as well, I condemn any intimidating or violent protests. People who step up and run for public office should be able to exchange policies and ideas without fear or any threats.
Thank you. Jonas Smith, Independent.
Thank you. I have to echo what Lenore said. I just can't see that what's being proposed right now is legal under the charter. It's certainly not ethical in my mind. Yukon College, I understand, just implemented a policy of separate entrances for vaccinated and non-vaccinated people. And I have to think, you know, if you're okay with separate entrances, what's next? Separate drinking fountains? Have we not lived through this before? So just to reiterate, I'm 100% opposed, and I think we should encourage people and not coerce them. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you. I believe that this is a drive to increase vaccination rates across the country. And as we stated already, Yukon has quite high vaccination rates. I believe that there should be medical exemptions and ability to move throughout the country. I haven't heard of anyone being denied an ability to fly based on vaccination status, but I could be wrong. I'm open to learning more.
Thank you. And Brendan Henley, Liberal Party of Canada.
We've lived through a very extraordinary time, and to Lenore's point, which I think is an important one, we have had already at many points had to balance individual rights versus a public health good, and try to use that lens, whether legal or public health, of using the least coercive means to achieve an end. We are still in a potential crisis with Delta. We may not yet be at those optimal vaccine rates. In the longer run, I think we're going to have fair and equitable policies. For now, I think we have to hit hard and drive our vaccine rates up to get through the pandemic, protect our healthcare system and our workers, and all of us.
15?
I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Question 3. In light of the recent discoveries of numerous unmarked graves at former residential school sites, Yukon First Nations are in need of the required resources to engage and support residential school survivors and families. Our question, if elected, what is your commitment to ensure the resources and supports are provided to Yukon First Nations? And we will begin with Conservative Party of Canada candidate Barbara Dunlop.
We were all shocked, I think, as Canadians at the discovery of the unmarked graves. And our hearts went out to the families involved. I can't imagine the pain of that as a parent. I think that as we move forward now, whatever happens next, whatever the next steps are, they need to be community-led, community-driven, and the timing needs to be set by the communities involved. The Conservative Party of Canada has significant language around reconciliation in the platform. They are looking at implementing part of the Truth and Reconciliation report that deals with the unmarked graves, looking at commemoration, looking
15.
at, sorry, oh, sorry, what was that? Looking at commemoration and looking at finding the records and also resourcing the continued search.
Thank you. Jonas?
Thank you. As a father myself, I just can't imagine what so far too many families have gone through. So what I'm going to say next might be hard for some people to hear, so I just wanted to give you a heads up. Sexual assault of children, pedophilia is about the most disgusting, horrific crime I can think of. And yet we live in a world where there is evidence of an international sex trade ring of children that has implications to members of the royal family and past presidents, yet the media barely bats an eyelash. It boggles my mind. Even here in Whitehorse, we had an issue of sexual assault against a child at a local school, and there's some pretty serious outstanding questions about how the government handled that. So I don't think we can ever change our future unless we learn from our lessons from the past. So I'm fully supportive of an inquiry, investigation, whatever is appropriate to examine every possible.
Thank you. Lisa Valens-Leduc.
Thank you, Christine. This question and where it brings me in my mind is to think it's not shocking. Indigenous people and families have been talking about this for years, for the duration of residential schools in this country. And this document came out in 2015. Calls to action number 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, and 77. And I think, and number 78 as well. This is the number of calls to action that are in here that is asking for Canada, for the government to make reparations, to do more, to stand up.
Thank you. And Brendan Henley?
Thank you. Three quick things from Liberal Party commitments. One is that a re-elected Liberal government will provide the necessary supports for communities who wish to undertake the work of burial searches. Second is the important mental health and wellness strategy of it now at $2 billion over 5 years for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, and also a process of obtaining a special interlocutor to work with Indigenous partners on a regulatory framework to address the justice issue of this tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you. Lenore?
I was horrified when we heard about the first of the mass graves that were found, which was in Kamloops. That was the 215. I was not shocked, only horrified. And the reason why I say that was because we knew this was coming, and we knew it because we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the Justice Murray Sinclair, who led that, had identified that there were thousands of at least 5,000 Aboriginal children who were unaccounted for. They haven't had all of the records released, but they knew that there was at least 5,000 that had gone missing. So it's, of course, absolutely horrifying. The one, I don't want to say good thing, there's nothing good about it, but one useful thing from it is that for anybody that had any doubt at all about whether the residential schools were as bad as people said they were, now they know.
Thank you. And we have 1 minute for follow-up follow-up comments, and we will start with Jonas Smith. Jonas?
Thank you. Just to pick up where I left off, we can't change our future unless we learn from our past. So I fully support an inquiry, an auditing of whatever records still exist, interviews of surviving staff. I mean, there have to be answers out there still. People need to know. The communities that were affected, the families need closure. I also support the repatriation of remains wherever possible to their home communities. I think it's the right thing to do, and it's the only way those communities will ever find peace. So I would work with whichever party forms government or the opposition party as necessary to ensure that this is dealt with appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa?
Thank you, Christine. We will implement all 94 calls to action. We'll appoint a special prosecutor to pursue those who inflicted harm. Churches and governments will hand over all records to help identify children and those who were involved in the deaths. We will fully fund the search for grave sites at former residential schools, and we will support and fully fund community-driven solutions for healing. NDPers like Charlie Angus and Mumalak Kagak stood with survivors demanding accountability from the Liberal government, from Minister Carol Bennett. The Liberals had 6 years. They had this document the whole time.
Thank you. And Brendan?
Thank you. Lenore's reference to Justice Murray Sinclair reminded me of when he spoke a few years ago to the Yukon Medical Association. And although most of us, but not all of us, knew about the residential schools and the legacy, I think it took him to drive the point and the tragedy home. And since that time, I had made that commitment through my previous work in public health to advance the cause of reconciliation in all its meanings, including continuing the commitment to honor the 94 calls to action. Thank you.
Thank you. Lenore?
I would just add that I see the finding of these graves to be sort of a continuation of the fact-finding process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So what it shows is that the fact-finding's not over. We need to continue that process. We need to provide support for First Nations so that they can do for these searches, and then they can do the necessary follow-up to that. We need to push the Catholic Church to release their records, which they have never done so, even though they ran many of the residential schools. And then lastly, we have to implement all of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. These are specific, concrete recommendations the government needs to follow up with.
Thank you. Barbara?
For me, reconciliation has to start with respect and understanding can only be gained through listening and learning and working with the impacted communities. As a starting point, the Conservative platform provides $1 billion over 5 years to boost First Nations mental health, and that includes support for innovative approaches such as land-based treatment programs that are developed and managed by First Nations people.
Thank you. Our next question is regarding environment and climate change. The impacts of climate change in the Yukon are clearly evident, and changes to our land, water, and wildlife have been swift and in some cases severe. Our question is, what commitments are each of you making with respect to combating climate change? And we will begin with New Democratic Party candidate Lisa Volens-Leduc. Lisa?
Thank you, Christine. I knew my turn would come around to go first. So reconciliation and the climate are one and the same. I put that at the core of this effort. Upholding Indigenous knowledge and respecting inherent sovereignty is part of that. Indigenous peoples have intimate connection to their homelands, territories, and resources, and have provided stewardship forever. Closely linked to this is our response to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit plus people. The Liberals say they're committed to addressing the climate crisis and turn around and build pipelines. We've already talked about the anti-science movement on the right, and we must move past delays and inaction. We will invest in Indigenous-led science and support the creation of Indigenous-managed protected areas.
Thank you. Brendan?
Thank you. Global warming is the single most important public health issue that we face. And we need clear goals and commitments. And we need to have a feasible action plan with targets, costs, and accountability. And I think that the Liberal Party's platform on climate change is ambitious while still feasible and supported by regulations and policy and costed. Some of the elements: achieve net zero emissions in Canada by 2050, require 100% of new vehicles to be zero emissions by 2035, end plastic waste by 2030, plant 2 billion trees, funding home retrofits, and funding Indigenous leadership in nature conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. Lenore.
This is my area. So obviously the Green Party feels passionately about the environment, and I feel passionately about the environment. Here in the Yukon, the most important thing that we can do is develop more renewable energy, because right now we are burning a lot of fossil fuels to produce energy. We have an expanding need here in Whitehorse. 10 months of the year now, we are burning fossil fuels to burn electricity. Global warming is arguably the most pressing, most challenging, most difficult, most important problem faced not just by Canada, but by the world, by this generation. And Canada's not doing nearly enough. I want to say that there's kind of been this collective guilt in Canada about not doing enough. The solution is actually pretty easy. We need to scale back our oil and gas industry. The oil sands alone.
Thank you. Barbara?
We can't ignore the reality of climate change. The Conservative Party will bring provinces and territories together to discuss the next steps in climate action. The Yukon has been disproportionately affected by climate change. Yukoners want to be responsible, they want to help, they want to contribute at a national and global level. And to do that, our efforts need to be collaborative. They need to be in partnership with governments and First Nations and communities. We need to look for local solutions at the community level that support reductions in carbon emissions while providing training and skilled jobs. Green energy, for example, we all saw the success story of the Oak Crow Solar Project. And if we innovate together, we can make cost savings, we can provide skilled jobs, and we can reduce our emissions.
Thank you. Jonas?
Thank you. I mean, as others have noted, we don't need people from Ottawa or Paris lecturing Yukoners on the realities of climate change. We just need to look out our window. I mean, we can go talk to the mammoth up at the Beringia Centre and see how climate change worked out for them. Yet alone talk to one of our neighbours from Lake Lebarge or Marsh Lake this summer, and the urgency that we now, or the new renewed sense of urgency we should all have to work on this together. But the reality in the Yukon is we have to heat our homes for more than half the year just to survive. Just about every single necessity we consume is trucked up or flown in here. So in my mind, the single most powerful and effective action a Yukoner can take to do our part is to pursue new hydro projects or an intertie with a neighboring jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have 1 minute for our follow-up comments, and we will start with Brendan Henley.
Thank you. Hard not to disagree with anything that's been put forward. I think I think the investment in renewable energy is critical, and I think that there are many opportunities for federal investments to support this in Yukon. I also agree that eliminating fossil fuel subsidies is critical, as committed to by the Liberal Party, to actually accelerate that elimination of fossil fuel subsidy by 2 years to 2023. Clearly, a carbon tax is evidence-based and effective, and the projections for the rising carbon tax needs to continue. And we need the whole package, and we need it in place quickly. This is the reason that motivated me to put myself forward as a candidate.
Thank you. Lenore?
I was just going to finish what I was saying, which is that the oil sands of Alberta are responsible for 10% of all of the greenhouse gases going into the air in Canada. And the Yukon, by the way, is responsible for about 1/10% of that amount, the total amount. It's not to say, obviously, that we should still keep fighting hard, But we, as Canadians collectively, have to recognize where the problem is and actually fight the problem where it is. In Canada, most of the provinces are actually making some progress, most of the provinces and territories, and all of their efforts are being wiped out by Alberta and Saskatchewan. We just have to recognize where the problem is. We could let the oil industry just shrink by attrition if the government would stop propping it up, including with buying pipelines.
Thank you. Barbara?
The Conservative Party would develop a national clean energy strategy that would include strengthening Canada's grid and making it more adaptable to regional conditions. Also would include a large-scale project to provide clean power to Yukon, developed in partnership with the Yukon. We'd be looking to compete in a world demanding cleaner products and lower emissions. As an example, we can produce the lowest emission LNG in the world, which could be a transition fuel to replace coal and also could be used as a backup to renewable power.
Thank you. Jonas?
So thank you. Just to continue with my earlier remarks. I understand the last 2 winters, Yukon Energy was within hours of running out of diesel to keep the lights on. And as we see people continuing to move the Yukon and new construction prioritizing electric heat, the popularity of electric vehicles increasing, the only way we're going to reduce our reliance on hydrocarbons is with other forms of clean energy. So again, my priority is partnerships with all levels of government, including First Nations for new hydro development, but I'd also support retrofits and upgrades to existing buildings to ensure that the buildings that we do have are as efficient as possible and use as little energy as required. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lisa?
Thank you. I read a really good book a few years ago. It was on CBC Canada Reads, and it was The Right to Be Cold by Sheila Watt-Cloutier. And I believe she's an Inuk woman from Nunavik, northern Quebec. And that really spoke to me. I would like to thank Jonas for pointing out the Southern Lakes. I live on Army Beach, so I was out there every day, as were my friends and community members from around the Southern Lakes and the rest of the territory. We'll work jointly with Indigenous leadership and communities to develop coordinated action plans to respond to climate change emergencies like wildfires and floods. An elder asked me, do you think that you can really change how Mother Earth is responding right now? And no, I can't. Our party can put in place ways to lower the emissions and try and mitigate risk. And we have to remember net zero in Canada if we're shifting that to other places.
Thank you. And that does wrap up our first part of the evening as we had questions informed by Yukon First Nations chiefs. We are going to take a 20-minute refreshment break. When we return, we will be transitioning to questions from audience members. So you can do that yet by, if you're tuning in through Zoom, just go to the chat room there. Facebook comments on the Facebook live feed, and everyone who's here in person, you're welcome to ask questions as well. We will return in 20 minutes at 6:50 p.m. to go into our audience question portion of the evening. Thank you. Okay. Good evening and welcome back to the All Candidates Forum for the federal election hosted by Council of Yukon First Nations. We started our evening with questions informed by Yukon First Nation chiefs, and we are going to start the second part of the evening with one more question that did not get read in the first part, so we will continue with that and then move on to the audience questions. A reminder of the dates of the election that we are talking about. We have advanced poll dates on September 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th. Polling day is September 20th, and you can vote any day leading up to polling day by special ballot. To find out more and to find out how you can do that, visit electionscanada.ca. We would also like to take this time to acknowledge the chiefs who have joined us in person this evening. CYFN Grand Chief Peter Johnson is in attendance. AFN Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief Kluani Adamak, and Liard First Nation Chief Stephen Charlie. Thank you for coming and welcome. We will now move on to question 5 from the questions informed by the Yukon First Nation chiefs for our candidates. And we will start the responses with Brendan Hanley. Our question is in regards to housing. Housing prices in the Yukon have hit an all-time high, and the Yukon is facing a housing crisis, specifically for those who require social housing. Our question is, please describe your housing platform and how it will address the current situation here in the Yukon. And we start with Liberal Party of Canada candidate Brendan Hanley.
Thank you. And thanks for the traffic lights this time. Yes, well, housing is, I would say, the issue that I heard the most of at the doors so far. And that's housing, whether in rural Yukon in any of the communities, or whether in knocking on doors in neighborhoods in Whitehorse and throughout the socioeconomic levels. So it affects recruitment, the ability to bring people into territory, and employment. The Liberal Party platform consists of 3 main components: making houses more affordable, increasing the housing supply, and instituting a home buyer's bill of rights. And I will continue with my next round.
Thank you. Lenore?
Affordable housing is a huge issue here in the Yukon, as it is everywhere in Canada, actually. Canada has some of the most expensive housing in the world, and the pricing of it has risen by leaps and bounds in the last couple of decades. More and more housing has become people's main investment, and I would say that that's been one of the impediments to affordable housing, is that people don't want anything that will lower the price of their own houses because it's become a big investment. Interest rates are one of the impediments, actually. That's one of the things that's driving up housing prices. But I would say that the biggest thing is that the federal government needs to put more money into it. We spend a lot of money on a lot of things, including things like roads, which are, I would say, less priorities than affordable housing. We should have directed funding for affordable housing.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
Yes, on the doorstep for me as well. I'm hearing about lack of available housing and the expense of housing in Whitehorse and also in the community. Availability is a serious issue for anybody who's moving up here, and also for economic development in the communities, and as well as in Whitehorse. You just can't bring staff in if you don't have anyone where to house them. Rents are skyrocketing. I understand that there are hundreds of Yukoners on the waiting list for Yukon housing, and people have identified a lack of available land as a serious issue for them as well to do with housing. Housing is critical in every community, and we need to explore options, working with First Nations and the communities to see how we might be able to resolve this issue, and look at perhaps in the construction of new housing, look at trades training for youth in the communities.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Okay, thank you. So our current housing situation is a matter of supply versus demand. And, you know, we don't have the supply to meet the demand. And we live in a territory that's the size of Spain with 40-some thousand people. So it's ludicrous that we don't have an adequate supply. And as others have mentioned, businesses can't attract or retain workers to see their businesses grow and serve their communities. This issue is, I've been traveling on the road the last few days. This has come up every community I've visited. It's difficult for the communities to attract and retain healthcare workers or law enforcement members or teachers. So it's a very big issue. So what I would do is work with whichever party forms government to ensure that their platform is implemented in a manner that it works for the Yukon reality. I would like to work with the private sector and non-governmental organizations as well.
Thank you. Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you, Christine. We are in the middle of a housing crisis across the country, and we're seeing immediately in the Yukon how this is affecting communities like Ross River, where overcrowding and substandard housing has contributed to the public health crisis during the pandemic. There's 350 Yukoners on the wait list for social housing, and the average cost has gone up $100,000 in 1 year for housing. We will work with Indigenous communities to implement the fully funded Indigenous National Housing Strategy within 100 days in office, working in collaboration and with funding to match. We cannot use the justice system as a replacement for housing, and we'll have 30-year mortgages, GST exemption for building affordable housing units, and invest in retrofitting hotels using a housing first model.
Thank you. And the candidates have 1 minute for follow-up comments, and we will start the follow-up comments with Lenore. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Okay, so we will. Green Party of Canada, Lenore Morris.
We would like to have more cooperative housing, more public housing, more supportive housing, and also money for things like land trust here in the Yukon. I'm working with one group now that's doing that. If the government can make land available, they are committed to permanently affordable housing for purchase.
Thank you. And we do have 1 minute for follow-up comments, and we are actually now going to start with Conservative Party of Canada, Barbara Dunlop, and then come back around to Lenore.
In the platform, the Conservatives will provide territories with stable, predictable federal housing funding. They have they will be enacting a for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing strategy, which has been asked for a number of years now. They'll implement a northern housing strategy in partnership with the Yukon. And through all of this, there will be a reserve of a funding envelope that will support infrastructure in the north, including housing.
Thank you. Jonas Smith?
So thank you. To continue, I would work with whichever government or whichever party forms government to ensure that their Northern Housing Plan works in the Yukon context. I would like to see private sector and NGOs step in to provide solutions. I think that those entities that are more accountable to the bottom line are more likely to ensure that public investment flows into actual housing as opposed to administration. Here in the Yukon, we're quite fortunate that Yukon First Nations are the largest landholders in a number of communities. I think Trondheim is the largest landholder in Dawson City, for example. Kwon Dun is the largest landholder in the city of Whitehorse. So there's a lot of work that we could do together. First Nations would be an essential partner to finding housing solutions. And frankly, nothing would work without First Nations support. So we need to do things across the continuum, whether it's seniors housing, social housing, as well as innovative solutions such as co-ops or leased land.
Thank you. Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you. The NDP and Jugmeet, we've centered our entire platform around people. And we believe everyone needs a home that is safe, secure, and affordable. We haven't seen increases under the Liberal government, and we saw even less under a Conservative government. And the NDP has a plan to build over 500,000 over 10 years of affordable housing units. The word affordable is what separates us from the other parties. We're the only one to include in our platform affordable housing units, and we also have supports then in there for rent.
Thank you. Brendan Henley?
Thank you. Three themes: affordability, supply, and buyers' rights. Affordability. One of the innovations will be a home buyer's savings account to enable tax-free savings to buy a house. In terms of supply, 1.4 million houses promised over 5 years, and as well a federal housing advocate and a housing plan that includes helping families achieve home ownership, building 20,000 more units of affordable rental housing, and also ensuring a revitalization of 130,000 units. So definitely a lot on affordability. Buyers' rights, trying to put a lid and a cap on flipping houses and speculation, and a number of other initiatives to support home buyers' rights.
Thank you. And Green Party of Canada candidate Lenore Morris.
First, I'm going to say, I falsely accused you. I did go first. I just have a lot to say. So I'll see just to say one thing, which is that I want to correct Lisa in saying that that none of the other parties have plans for affordable housing. They do. Certainly the Green Party has a detailed plan with respect to affordable housing. I think everybody knows it's a big, big issue in Canada. It's a rights issue, it's a justice issue, and we're all trying to solve it. I think the Green Party's got a good plan.
Thank you. And that does wrap up our questions from the questions that were informed by Yukon First Nations chiefs. And we will now move on to the portion of the evening where we will be delivering questions from audiences. And these are from audience members who are here in person, people who are tuning in over the radio or over Facebook or Zoom. And it is being broadcast on Cohen FM radio 98.1 and Whitehorse 90.5 in the communities, Facebook Live, and through Zoom. The first question, and we will start with Jonas Smith, and we will have 1 minute to answer, as well as a 1 minute follow-up, as they were with the first series of questions. Yukon First Nations have been restricting Aboriginal rights to harvest Yukon River salmon for well over 20 years. How do you plan to address this major issue for Yukon First Nations on a national front? Jonas Smith, Independent.
Thank you. Great question. I'm a fisherman. That's one of my favorite things in the world to do. Some of my most precious memories are Tashin Creek or Dalton Post, and it literally breaks my heart to think that my children will not grow up to have those memories, and I won't be able to share those experiences with them. So I think it's very important to work with all partners on both sides of the border, because obviously the fish that end up on our side have to travel through American waters. So what I would like to do is ensure that the salmon discussion is included in the larger discussion of all things cross-jurisdictional, cross-border with the United States. So that includes standing up for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ensuring that the Americans honor their treaty commitments to the Shakwak Agreement, the North Alaska Highway, and others. Yep.
Thank you. New Democratic Party of Canada, Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you, Christine. This question is something I will need to learn more about to fully have an answer to, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I can't know all things, and I can't know the perspectives of everyone around me. So I would really appreciate some additional information on that, and will endeavor to get that. We have seen record low chum. I know that in Alaska, they had to have it shipped up, like chum had to be flown up. Indigenous people have a right to eat their traditional and country foods, and that's going to incorporate how we address the climate crisis and reconciliation. So I'm not going to belabor the point that I don't know much about this issue, but I will endeavor to learn more. I certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you. Brendan Henley, candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Thank you. When I was visiting Teslin, I spoke with people who were preparing salmon, and it was actually salmon, as Jonas alluded to, flowing in from Atlin, as there were no local salmon to harvest. And I heard similar stories again in Oak Crow, Carmacks, and other communities. So salmon stocks are definitely in peril, and it's affecting a whole way of life for First Nation people, and the ability not just to harvest food for elders and communities, but that ability to pass on traditional ways of being and knowing to youth and children. And it's a matter of food security. There is a Pacific Salmon Initiative announced by the Liberal government in June 2021, and with over 600 million invested. And I have hope in that strategy to be able to determine next steps. I agree that the cross-border initiative is also something that we need to advocate for.
Thank you. Green Party of Canada, candidate Lenore Morris.
This is something that I actually do have some direct knowledge of, because when I was a young person, when I was in my late teens and I was in Dawson City, I worked for the organization that became Hand Fisheries. So what this was an organization that sent out boats to the fishermen on the river, and they brought in salmon, brought it back into town, and where it was frozen, where it was sold, where it was shipped. So it was acting as a kind of a cooperative. And at that time, there were a number of commercial fishermen that were living and working on the river. A number of them were First Nations people, but some of them were non-First Nations people. And there were a lot of salmon in the river. So I'm talking about almost 40 years ago. But it's shocking to me how in a short period of time, because it's not this year it's chum, but every year there's not nearly enough fish as there should be. And that the government has let that situation come to pass.
Thank you. Conservative Party of Canada, candidate Barbara Dunlop.
Yeah, in the Yukon, people have a strong connection to the land and to the animals. The salmon stocks have obviously been under pressure, and year over year, the numbers just seem to keep dropping. Under Chapter 16 co-management regimes, the Fish and Wildlife Management Board and the Salmon Subcommittee offer great opportunities to work collaboratively on challenges such as this. I think it would be a good idea to work on some surveys and work together on surveys. We need to move forward together for sustainable harvesting and manage the resource for future generations.
Thank you. And we will move up to the 1-minute follow-up comments and start with NDP candidate Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you. As I'm rifling through my notebook here, my session binder, if you'll call it that, NDP are going to implement the Cohen Commission report fully, and that includes sustainable salmon farming with enclosed spaces for them to move through their waters. And we'll also make sure that species recovery efforts will respect Indigenous rights and embrace traditional knowledge to increase biodiversity. So working in partnership, not in consultation, with Yukon First Nations to support the efforts that the land defenders and guardians are quite well aware of.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Thank you. I was thinking as Lisa did her turn on a long conversation I was fortunate to have with the Oak Crow chief and members of council. And this is climate change in action, another example of a climate change effect of habitat loss, of overfishing. I think it's a matter of listening to the wisdom of the people who have lived off fish and caribou, for that matter, for centuries. I think the will is there, the funding is there. I think the advocacy on the international side is important, but this is a matter of listening to the wisdom of our people for the appropriate next steps.
Thank you. Lenore Morris?
Lisa mentioned the Cohen Commission, and for those who don't know what that is a commission, it was a public commission that was undertaken in British Columbia in 2010 after, in 2009, the return of the Fraser River salmon came in at less than 10% of the number that were projected. So the Fraser River salmon is the biggest and has traditionally been the most productive salmon fishery in the entire world. And Canada, thanks to our Department of Fisheries and Oceans, has been putting that at a huge amount of risk, primarily not with climate change, although that's part of it, but with fish farms that have been fought tooth and nail by First Nations in British Columbia, and that are still not banned. Some people know, I was recently in British Columbia. There are dozens and dozens of fish farms putting wild salmon at risk.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop?
I'll just add that I think protecting habitat is important, and we need to work collaboratively and cooperatively before it's too late. As I said, the stocks seem to be going down year over year, and we need to look at the resources and the cooperative management that it's going to take to stabilize it and bring the stocks back up again.
Thank you. And Jonas Smith?
Well, thank you. Just to reiterate, I think there's only so much Yukoners can do. And in fact, I would say Yukon First Nations in particular have already done more than their fair share on this. We have to talk to our international partners, whether it's an issue of overfishing or bycatch, or if it's something environmental. At the end of the day, we need more fish returning to our side of the border. So we have to prioritize this in our negotiations with the United States in the larger suite of things that our two countries deal with. And I would make that a priority. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for our next question, I would like to invite Grand Chief for the Council of Yukon First Nations, Peter Johnson, to the podium. Hi, Peter.
Good evening, and I just want to thank you, Sagun Chief, for the opportunity. What would your government do to help support the implementation of our final and self-government agreements here in the territory? Thank you.
And we will start with NDP candidate Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the question, Chief Johnston. This is another one that I will have to learn more about. I will endeavor to support the final self-government agreements, taking lead from Yukon First Nations, understanding the priorities that Yukon First Nations would like to see in the agreements, and take that lead and run with it. I believe this is all part of reconciliation and Yukon being a leader, and I don't want to pick the wrong word, but it's okay to make mistakes because I'll correct. Being an example for the rest of the country to follow as we move towards land agreements.
Thank you. Brendan Henley?
Thanks. I was hoping that the lawyer would be able to go next to help all of us in answering this question. Yeah, this is again. I cannot claim any technical or legal knowledge apart from the conversations that I've had so far. Which, and again, probably hearing that in almost with any council members or chiefs or leaders that I have had the opportunity to speak with, and that is about honoring agreements and supporting implementation. So, of course, the commitment to advocate for implementation and what that means per First Nation according to the agreements that they had signed.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
So the Yukon's in a special position because we do have 11 self-government agreements and 11 land claims agreements that have been made. And so for those First Nations, which is not all of them, there's still another 3, including Chief Charlie's First Nation, who don't have treaties yet with the Canadian and the Yukon government. For those First Nations who do have agreements, then I would say it's working with them cooperatively. It's providing money for programming and for implementation. It's not fighting them. I hear all the time from, I have a sister who acts as a negotiator. She works for the TH Trondakwitchin in Dawson, and she tells me all the time of just how difficult she finds it dealing sometimes with the, the federal negotiators. The Canadian government's made these commitments. We just need to honor them.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
Yeah, Yukon is in a unique situation in Canada with 11 settled land claims agreements. The land claims agreements, along with self-government agreements and implementation plans, are the foundation for self-determination. I worked in the Land Claims Secretariat back when the UFA and the first 4 agreements were signed. The initial intent seems just as relevant today, although I find myself looking at them through quite a different lens. In some cases, aspirations have turned into reality, and that's just with the little I know about the accomplishments of First Nations and their development corporations. In others, there seems to be much work left to be done. Going forward, I would take responsibility to listen to First Nations, to learn, and to work on building trusting relationships. I hope to learn the priorities from First Nations leadership and their citizens so that I could effectively push those issues in Ottawa.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Okay, thank you. So to answer the question, what would I do to support implementation? As an independent, the answer is whatever you want me to do. I'm not bound to partisan platforms. So whether that is a collective priority through AFN or CYFN or an individual First Nations priority, it would be my job to work with either the governing party or the opposition party, depending on the makeup of the House of Commons, to ensure that Yukon First Nation priorities are heard and understood in Ottawa. So whether it's First Nation language programming support, elements related to the TRC, former residential school sites, justice, forestry, whatever it is. YESA, I think we've been talking about YESA for a lot of years. I think there's been a lot of talk. It's time to finally get together on that and make sure that we come up with something that works for everyone. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I would work to educate Ottawa. Anyone here who has worked in Ottawa knows how much time you spend just explaining the differences.
Thank you. And for our follow-up, we have 1 minute for each candidate, and we will start with Brendan Henley, a candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Yeah, again, to expand a little bit on some of these conversations and the themes, and just to reflect what Jonas has said, the themes similar that I heard. Again, depending on the First Nation, education is one of those themes of bringing Indigenous ownership into education. It's about language and culture development. It's about supporting youth development. And of course, food security and habitat, salmon and caribou. And so, again, reflecting whatever is needed in supporting what implementation would mean for those theme areas, I think is important. The other thing I'd point out is the signing in June 2021 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how that can help to influence honoring the agreements.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
I would just add a couple of things. There's a number of ways that the federal government can directly assist First Nations. Some of it simply with money, but a lot of money comes into the Yukon from the federal government. A lot of it goes to the Yukon government. it can be earmarked. I would say some of the priorities would be language revitalization, dealing with the incarcerated people. So the criminal law is federal jurisdiction. We have a huge overrepresentation of our Indigenous people incarcerated and in the criminal justice system generally. And we have a big problem with them being returning to their communities and being returning to general society. And that's something where I think that the federal government could make it a lot bigger priority than they have.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
While I was in Department of Economic Development, I worked on various projects with a number of different DevCorps. Each of the projects with the First Nations or with the DevCorp was interesting and energizing and exciting, and I'd look forward to engaging in detail on more of those projects and looking to see how I might be able to help.
Thank you. Jonas Smith?
Thank you. So just to put a finer focus on the question about specifically supporting implementation, I mean, Chief Adamak, Chief Johnson, you know what it's like dealing with people in Ottawa. They just don't appreciate the unique Yukon reality. So a big part of my job would be to ensure that that is considered in Ottawa programming. We've all heard of programs that are released to help First Nations on reserve or whatnot, but because of Yukon's reality, either because settled First Nations have settlement or non-settled First Nations aren't on reserve, that the Yukon First Nations fall through the cracks. So I think educating Ottawa would be a big part of that job to ensure that we implement your agreements, explaining that while the principles are similar, UNDRIP and the UFA have different approaches. And at the end of the day, I'd also want to advocate for the non-settled First Nations here too, because we don't want them to get left behind. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lisa Valenzuela.
Thanks, Christine. We're all treaty holders, every person who lives here in Canada. And we need to honor those agreements and engage in true nation-to-nation relations and do that with free and prior consent. The Liberal government has spent more money on Indigenous lawsuits in the first 3 years of power than Harper did in his last 3, which is over 100 million. And these fights are, I don't know why they would continue. Like, I've also heard stats that they've spent more, like this is the largest amount of money they spend out of their justice budget is on fighting Indigenous people. And I would like to advocate and be a strong voice to oppose those lawsuits continuing, much like Jody Wilson-Raybould attempted to do when she was a justice minister.
Thank you. And for our next question, I would like to invite to the podium Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief, Kluani Adamak. Hello, Kluani.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge the organizers, of course, candidates. Really appreciate your responses thus far. Given the globally integrated nature of our economy, climate policy and meaningful climate policy is challenging to develop and even more challenging to implement. Yukon First Nations and First Nations across the country are doing the hard work of reimagining our economies and implementing solutions, prioritizing justice and equity. What specific commitments will you or your party make to support Indigenous-led climate action that goes beyond tokenism and ineffective consultation and ineffective engagement?
Thank you. And we will start with Green Party of Canada candidate Lenore Morris.
The First Nations in the Yukon are already leading. It's been a sore point for me, and I think for a lot of environmentalists for a long time, that Yukon Energy has been so deficient in this area that they didn't make renewable energy a priority, even as the demand for electricity grew and grew and grew over a long period. I would absolutely commit to assisting any First Nation who wants to develop a renewable energy project. Some of those are easy, some of those are hard, some of them are already being done. So Old Crow is the one that's getting the most attention, but we've also got it's Little Salmon Carmacks that is investigating geothermal. We have biomass. We have more in, I believe it's the White River. No, not White River, sorry, one of the other ones. I'm watching the clock.
Thank you.
Running out of time.
Barbara Dunlop?
The Conservative Party is taking a holistic look at how we deal with the climate change challenge, in part looking to how we can compete in the world and what Canada can do, including what communities can do, what First Nations can do to develop products that can be sold worldwide that will meet with the demand, then right up to building resiliency and preparing for the impacts of flood and wildfire. There's a recognition that the North is being severely impacted by climate change. And so along with fighting climate change, we need to be prepared to deal with it as it comes along. They're looking at, as I said, a clean energy project for the Yukon, looking at building resiliency into the grid, which is very important for all Yukon communities to get off fossil fuels and to be in a position where you can plug in some electric cars,
Thank
et cetera.
you. Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Thank you. Again, I'll echo what others have said, that the Yukon is unique, and we're a generation ahead of a lot of the country when it comes to First Nation leadership on all matters related to climate and environment. You know, I'd think of things like wildlife management through our renewable resource councils. So we're already quite a ways ahead of our counterparts to the south. But just to go back to what I said to an earlier question, I think the single most meaningful thing that a Yukoner can do to do our part for climate change is to develop additional hydropower. And I envision a relationship with significant Yukon First Nation investment. Settled First Nations have hundreds of millions of dollars that could potentially go towards such a development. And some of the non-settled First Nations have some of the best hydro capacity in their traditional territories. So I envision an arrangement that all Yukon First Nations could benefit.
Thank you. Lisa Volens-Leduc.
Thank you, and thank you for the question, Chief Adamak. I had to flip through the whole binder because it is a holistic approach, and climate is intersected through all of that. The New Democrats believe the time has come for fundamentally different approach to Crown Indigenous relations in Canada, one based on the recognition of the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples and self-determination. We will invest in green energy, which will bring that green energy development to companies, bringing jobs and training and funding to go alongside that. Lots of Yukon First Nations have shown interest in building renewable energy projects, and this represents energy sovereignty and good jobs, the green jobs that I was speaking of. And we support these developments. There's First Nations interested in wind power. Vantakwichin has the largest solar park north of 60, and Taku, there we go.
Thank you.
So much.
Brenda, we will have a chance for follow. Brendan Henley.
Thank you. Thanks for a great question. Chief Adamak and you yourself have been a leader in this area, and I think some of the most interesting conversations I've had around the territory have been about renewable energy and about First Nations leadership in renewable energy. It makes me think that as climate change is indeed a global crisis, it is also an incredible opportunity, and I think we need to follow and to accelerate these discussions in terms of appropriate investments and partnerships in developing renewable energy with the leadership. First Nations are the witnessers, and they are the leaders for the future developments in renewable energy.
Thank you. And now we have 1 minute for follow-up comments, and we will start with Barbara Dunlop.
I think the key would be to work with communities on the ground and understand their priorities. And a part of my job would be to ensure that national programs would work for First Nations and would work in the North. And I would advocate for that as a colleague and with the support of either the governing party or with the official opposition by my side in fighting for what Yukoners need.
Thank you. Jonas Smith?
Thank you. I talked a lot in the last election about biomass and the synergies there and the opportunities, I think, between local training opportunities in small communities, reducing risk of forest fire due to climate change, and then also just the opportunity to get communities off diesel. But again, with hydro, I envision an arrangement with federal investment, private sector expertise, and ultimately First Nations stewardship in a manner that our children and our children's children can benefit from a legacy of clean, green power for years and years to come, similar to the legacy that the current Yukoners have enjoyed with our existing hydro infrastructure.
Thank you. Lisa Volens-Leduc.
Thank you. A new democratic government will replace mere consultation with a standard of free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous communities affected by government policies. And I will be a strong ally and advocate for more renewable energy projects built and operated by First Nations. The entire NDP stands behind that. And reconciliation has to happen now. Like, I just can't stop going back to that in these questions of land. It's absolutely one of the main reasons I believe reconciliation has stalled where it has, and it hasn't all been implemented as laid out in the TRC. And more members of parliament need to stand up and start demanding that action happen, that change happens, that we respect the environment and the land and listen to those who have lived on it for generations.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Yeah, again, I think this is an area where I have heard many interesting ideas, and as I said, many of them exciting, but without myself having of course, the technical knowledge behind it. But I think these are this is like, let's talk and let's see how the federal government can be the right partner to build partnerships. This is our future. We have a chance, just as Canada has a chance to be a leader in clean technology. Yukon has a chance to be a leader in Canada with the advantage of settled First Nations as well, and the development corporations that can equally invest.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
So I'm grateful that Yukon First Nations have taken the lead in this area, in particular in the area of renewable energy. That can be wind, solar, geothermal, small hydro, biomass, which is easily combined with fire smarting. So that's the production of electricity. There's the other side of it as well, which is the use of electricity. So building retrofits, new buildings should all be highly energy efficient, but also things like converting vehicle fleets, especially some of the communities, their vehicles are driven long distances, and having those vehicles be electric or at least hybrid, like plug-in hybrid, could make a huge difference. And all of those things will create jobs in the communities, a skill development, like a skilled workforce in the communities, and reduce greenhouse gases.
Thank you. For our next question, I would now like to invite Liard First Nation Chief Stephen Charlie to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of this and who've worked to put this together. And I'd also like to recognize the individuals that put their name forward to represent the Yukon at the federal level. Wish you all the best to each and every one of you. I know how difficult it is to run for leadership, but it's good to see that you put your name out there. My concern is Liard First Nation, as you are well aware, is one of the 3 First Nations in the Yukon that have not had an arrangement, an agreement with the federal or territorial governments or provincial government in that matter, because we have lands that run into the NWT and British Columbia. And we're presently have many challenges within our traditional territory in regards to sovereignty, rights and title, and just assertion by government on our rights and interpretation of those rights. So we battle on a daily basis, and right now we're presently still under the Indian Act, a racist piece of legislation that is totally unacceptable in this day and age, but it's what we have to work under. And my question is that to the candidates, there's a lot of issues that are at a territorial level, but what we're doing right now is we're at the Rights and Reconciliation table, and we're moving forward with rights and title, sovereignty, self-determination. So our starting point would be where the UFA left off for the self-governing agreements. We're looking for something much greater, and in regards to self-determination. And I just want to know how, if any of you are elected, and one will be, how you will represent and support Liard First Nations and the other First Nations that are not signed at these tables, and continue to promote our rights and at these tables and our self-determination. The First Nations that have not signed under the UFA have really suffered and really been neglected in the whole process with the territorial, federal, and provincial governments. And it's a shame, actually. But this would be the question to you potential candidates representing the Yukon government. And thank you very much, and all the best.
Merci.
Thank you for that question, Chief Charlie. And we will go to Jonas Smith, independent, for to start our answers. Jonas?
Thank you, Chief. I want to see certainty in our territory. I want to see your people prosper the same as the 11 other First Nations. So Liard, Ross River, White River, I fully commit to advocating for you in Ottawa to pursue modern agreements outside of the UFA if that is what you so choose. I think those discussions might not necessarily be easy, because they do also have to consider their effects on the settled First Nations of whom you share traditional territory, but it's high past time that we have those agreements in place. And I just turned to some of my previous comments from earlier tonight, that a big part of my job would be to educate those in Ottawa to ensure that they appreciate our unique reality here, and to ensure that you do not fall through the cracks. And for me, self-determination truly only comes with self-reliance. So I want to make sure that your people have the tools they need to provide for yourselves, whether it's forestry, whether it's...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa Vollens-Leduc.
Thank you, and thank you, Chief Charlie, for the question. I would initially sit down with each of the First Nation chiefs or representatives as appropriate. We do have to remember that it's a nation-to-nation relationship, and that is with the Crown, not necessarily with the territory. That would be based on consent from the First Nation, if that was the interest. The Crown is a pretty large body, and if there were information sharing that had to occur with the province, I don't think that should be put on the First Nation to do. I will reiterate that we will replace mere consultation with a standard of free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous communities affected by government policies, period. We also have a plan to implement UNDRIP.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Charlie, and I'm really glad that you're here and we're able to ask that question. And I've had I did have the opportunity to have a similar discussion with the chief of Ross River Dene Council, as well as members of White River First Nation, and certainly the themes are very similar, and the answers, as you yourself said, are not easy. But I'm completely interested and willing to be a listener, to learn myself some of the complexities, and then to be an advocate. I do hope that the signing of UNDRIP, which is really designed as a roadmap for future for real reconciliation, will also help as a guiding light to enable us to make a constructive future.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
I would start with meeting with the First Nations and finding out what it is that they want and what kind of support that they want. But there's two specific things that I can think of. One is helping to fund negotiations. So negotiations often are very, very lengthy processes. There's usually lawyers involved, and we are expensive. But there's also often a lot of other experts that have to be brought in. It can be a tremendously expensive process. And what's been done in the past was that this was sort of added to the tab of First Nations, and it became a huge ball and chain for them, even when they got to an agreement. The other thing was I would encourage the government to negotiate in better faith with First Nations so that the First Nations don't have to keep suing the federal government here. I'm well aware of the number of lawsuits that have gone on, the number of times we're making.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
Having worked in the Land Claims Secretariat, I have a little bit of knowledge and an appreciation for the complexity of negotiations and how daunting they can be. And as a first step, I would certainly want to sit down and talk to representatives, talk to the chiefs, and to find out where the priorities were, what the status of the negotiations were, and how I could help as an advocate in Ottawa, particularly helping people in Ottawa understand what the reality is and the situation is in the Yukon, and giving them an appreciation for what it is that we would be trying to accomplish.
Thank you. And now our follow-up comments. We will start with Lisa Vollins-Leduc.
Thank you, Christine. First and foremost, and throughout the process, I will listen. I'll listen like I heard on the radio when Ross River Dene Council and the Casca Dene had requested that folks not go and hunt on their traditional territories. I'll listen like when I was told that the moose are migrating differently now and they're not in the same spaces that they were before. I will listen and try to hear the nuances that may not be said out loud, to attach the emotion to what is tied to the land and to the people and to the language. And I will advocate through that listening process and ask questions as I'm talking and make sure that I clearly understand what is being asked of me.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Yeah, I just will take up another point that Chief Charlie, that you made, and that was the disadvantage of not having the signed agreement, or what the disadvantages are that can result, and certainly being having heard from those communities about the lack of opportunities, the relative lack of opportunities compared to the signed First Nations. So it definitely has consequences. and again, just to be to understand more and to be a listener and ultimately an advocate. And I would dearly hope that we could help to make progress together.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
I would just add a couple of things, and this time I am reading from the Green Party policy. So the first one is formally repudiate the doctrine of terra nullius, which is the doctrine of discovery, and other doctrines of superiority. So that's one of the things that settlers used when they came to North America to justify them essentially taking all the land because supposedly nobody was here. And so it was ours. The second part of that that I'm reading is guided by Indigenous leadership, establish a process to transition out from under the Indian Act. With Indigenous leaders at the helm, establish processes for self-governing Indigenous peoples and nations to transition out from under the Indian Act, grounding this in the doctrine of free, prior, and informed consent. There's just the 3 First Nations that are under the Indian Act here. There's hundreds across Canada. It's long past time it was abolished.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
And I will just add, and it's echoing some of what other people have said here, that I would listen patiently and try to understand as effectively as possible what it is that where the problems were, where the challenges were, because if I don't understand exactly where you're coming from and what it is you're trying to achieve, it's impossible for me to effectively advocate with Ottawa.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
So thank you. I'll just build on my comment previously about self-determination and self-reliance. You know, I would like to establish trust and build on success and build momentum through perhaps baby steps, individual deals, whether it's forestry so that you can help provide the building materials for the growing Yukon and fuel wood, which is a real challenge going into this winter right now, whether it's hydro capacity so that you can get your own community off diesel, but also do your part to help fight climate change, whether it's construction contracts to ensure that your citizens have good paying jobs in your home community. I would very much like to see the non-settled First Nations sign on to YESA so that there's certainty across the territory so that the non-settled First Nations can fully take advantage of the vast resource potential in all 3 of your traditional territories. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for our next question, I would like to invite again to the podium CYFN Grand Chief Peter Johnson.
Chief, once again, just a personal question. What have you done personally to move the bar forward when it comes to reconciliation with Yukon First Nations? Thank you.
Thank you, Grand Chief. And we will begin with Brendan Henley, Liberal Party of Canada candidate.
Thank you. I'm thinking again to what I said earlier about listening to Murray Sinclair when he was here and when we were addressed as the Yukon Medical Association, and I think it was a turning point for many. I am also pleased that the Yukon Medical Association is this year undertaking a number of initiatives with the theme of reconciliation. And I think in terms of personal actions, sorry, I forgot about the 1 minute for a minute there. I did take that opportunity to advocate for reconciliation and trying to push reconciliation as a kind of a lens, just sometimes as we use an equity lens in public health, to use a reconciliation lens for activities. And I'll leave the rest for my next round.
Thank you. Green Party of Canada candidate Lenore Morris.
I'd start with 2 things. First, I can remember when I moved back to the Yukon, which was after law school, and things, even though that was only it was 22 years ago. Things have actually changed radically since then. I'm going to say mostly for the better. The sort of prejudice and bigotry against First Nations people used to be really seriously bad. And I can remember on a number of occasions sort of speaking up when people were making comments and saying that that's just completely not acceptable. I've seen firsthand, I think we all have seen firsthand, some of the really unfortunate, tragic results of the residential school, the legacy of that, and some of the social problems associated with that. I think kindness and understanding and knowledge can go a really long way.
Thank you. Conservative Party of Canada candidate Barbara Dunlop.
Yes, I'm the former Film and Sound Commissioner of the Yukon, and in the context of my job there, I learned about the importance of authentic representation, of artistic representation of First Nations people. I had a chance to work with First Nations musicians, First Nations documentary filmmakers, and First Nations animators. And together with them, we were able to create products and bring those artistic products to the wider world, which brought some of the Yukon First Nation stories and took them out to a wide audience.
Thank you. Jonas Smith, Independent.
Thanks for the question, Chief. You and I have had this conversation on more than one occasion over the years that often governments throw the word reconciliation around a lot, but it's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. So I like to think that I've spent the last 10 years of my life in political service, traveling the territory, talking to Yukoners, First Nation leaders, educating myself, and then in turn educating others. Early in my political career, a big part of our platform was the Jackson Lake Land-Based Healing Center. It was establishing the Center of Hope, the downtown homeless shelter. It was expanding the Sarah Steele building. I've served with a number of Yukon First Nation MLAs. The late Darius Elias was a good friend of mine, and he actually was. I was serving with him when the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action were released, and I remember sitting in my office.
Thank you. New Democratic Party of Canada, Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for the question, Chief. I spent 16 years working in youth justice. When I first got there, I loved the job. I still enjoy the job, and I really love the kids and the communities and their families that I worked with. I spent my career trying to change policies that were in effect in that building. I did everything that I could. I developed relationships with the youth that were there to get to know who they were and to learn more about their family and where they were coming from. I spent that same amount of time in human rights advocacy with our union. I was part of the National Human Rights Committee, and I spent a lot of time working with the Indigenous circle there. I consume media only outside of my own reflection to help inform a decolonizing approach to my own life. And I'm running for the NDP. Our platform intersects everything through reconciliation.
Thank you. And we will have a 1 minute opportunity for 1 minute follow-up, and we will begin with Lenore Morris. Lenore?
Following up on what I was saying earlier, I have made a big effort to educate myself. Grand Chief Johnson, you won't remember this, but I remember that when the first time we met, you asked me if I had taken the First Nations 101 course, and at that point I had not taken it, and I subsequently have taken it. A huge number of people have taken that course, and it's great. I'm so glad that a lot of organizations, including the Law Society of the Yukon, have made it a requirement for their members. I want to say in the course of my work, I've worked with a lot of First Nations. I'm talking about both First Nations, the organizations, also individuals. I've also worked in the area of child protection, so I've seen some of the issues on the ground and was involved when the legislation behind that was reformed. I was involved in that process.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
Yeah, and sticking with working with First Nations artists, We spent a lot of time at the Film and Sound Commission listening and learning and understanding the aspirations of the people we were working with. We helped individuals to explore their artistic expressions and understand what direction they might want to take it next. And we found creative ways to resource projects so that people could get them underway and get some foundational financing to get going. And we helped connect people with mentors and bring productions to fruition.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Well, thank you. Just to pick up where I left off, I had the honor of working with the late Darius Elias, and we sat in my office together on the day that the calls to action came out. And so my very first impression of the calls to action were seen through his eyes and with his explanation. And for anyone who had the pleasure of knowing Darius, that he had the ability to make some very profound statements with very few words. And so I've actually found myself thinking back to that day more than once over the last few weeks. In my last campaign, I had 6 different First Nation chiefs endorse my candidacy. I have a number who are supporting me this time as well. As I've talked about a bunch tonight, I've spent a lot of time educating Ottawa on the realities of the Yukon. And I've spent a lot of time in the mining industry where I've been on the opposite side of the negotiating table with First Nations, but I have learned that you need to engage First Nations early and that their role is essential.
Thank you. Lisa Valenzuela.
I have a lot to still do. I have family who are Indigenous, who are Anishinaabe from Ontario, and I'm reconnecting with them. Their mother was like a grandmother to me, and they were moved out of the house when I was growing up. I literally ran a full campaign when I ran for the regional executive vice president to the PSAC North. My entire campaign was based on decolonizing that organization because its practices are based solely on the same colonial structure that exists in the government of Canada. And that was my intention, and I tried really hard to engage that membership and that delegation. And I didn't get elected, but I lost only by 7 votes. And to me, that's important. I really, really wanted to have an effective, I wanted to be a leader in that organization.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Thank you. Reconciliation is one of the 3 themes that I brought into my campaign, so it is important to me. And as Jonas says, it is a much used word these days. In my view, it's a word that means honouring commitments to Canada's Indigenous people and correcting historical injustices. Back to the personal side, I think one of the things that I helped to move forward was advocating for First Nation 101, the course, as a minimum requirement for physician licensure. That came out of our a motion at our YMA meeting in 2019, and is now, we are the first medical body to have that as a requirement of licensure. The other thing is talking to my children about residential schools and what that means and what that has meant as they are learning about it in school.
Thank you. As we move along this evening with questions from citizens throughout the territory, our next question is, how would you address the education gaps faced by Yukon First Nations children and youth? And how would you support First Nation-led solutions, such as a school? And we will start with Barbara Dunlop. Barbara?
Well, education is a territorial responsibility. Looking at it from the national level, the Conservative Party platform includes a lot of language around job training, and in particular, apprenticeships and opportunities for youth and for First Nations people to gain the job skills that they need for the jobs of the future. Apprenticeship is a particular passion of mine. I have a son who's an automotive mechanic, a husband who's a former automotive mechanic, and relatives who are electricians and machinists, and I absolutely see the value of those kinds of skilled trades. And one of the things that I would be working towards would be ensuring that Yukon students had opportunities to understand how they could effectively learn the skilled trades and get a good job going forward for their future.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Thank you. So I'll echo what Barb mentioned, that education is primarily a territorial responsibility. But that said, I'm certainly supportive of First Nation educational opportunities. Now, whether that's an Indigenous component of existing traditional school, if it's federal funding to ensure that those programs can go forward. I'm actually a big supporter of Indigenous languages. In fact, that was one of my main submissions to the Conservative Party in the platform development, which ended up in the platform. I'm also a big believer in land-based programming and traditional lifestyles. I think that's not only good for Yukon First Nation students, but all Yukon students. I think everyone should learn to hunt and fish and smoke meat and about traditional medicines. So what I think we could do to get around it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Christine. I had an incredible opportunity early in the campaign to meet with Melanie Bennett, the ED for the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate, and her passion and vision for Yukon First Nations school in the territory is one that the NDP will fully support and advocate for. Although education is said to be provincial and territorial, this is of Yukon First Nations, and we don't just believe in nation-to-nation relationships through reconciliation. The NDP will practice that, and we are practicing that. There's more, but I won't get into it yet. I'll save that for my next response. Thank you.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Yeah, again, I think it's recognizing the federal role. It's looking for where partnerships and funding is available. So, for instance, infrastructure, northern infrastructure funding. If it were towards, for instance, an actual building or a new school. But I also think education and a successful graduation begins with early learning. It begins with a healthy start in life. So I think there are many federal funds and opportunities already in place, or potentially to really reinforce a positive start in life, parenting support, and all those supports to get off to a good, healthy start to set kids up for success.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
I'm going to say two things because we keep talking about jurisdiction here. So federal government has jurisdiction over Indians, and I'm putting that in air quotes for anybody that's just hearing. So there is jurisdiction. More importantly, the federal government has a lot of money, and that, in fact, is how, to a very large extent, they exert their influence over other areas, including, for example, health, which is provincial and territorial jurisdiction. The gaps that we're talking about start pretty early on. So every few years we get a report that goes public that says that the First Nations students are not doing as well as the non-First Nations students. That really has to be addressed. This is a situation where the First Nations students, or some of them, simply need a lot of support. I'm going to agree with Dr. Hanley. It needs to start early. It needs to start at the preschool level. We need to have support in the communities.
Thank you. And now an opportunity for a 1-minute follow-up comments or response, and we will start with Jonas Smith. Jonas?
Thank you. So to pick up where I left off, just in a way to respect the jurisdiction, the reality is outcomes must improve. It's unacceptable. They can't continue with this gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous outcomes. And I think all Canadians have a responsibility to do our part there. So I would be in favor of supporting Yukon First Nation-led programming. And so I don't know what that necessarily would look like, if it's in partnership with Yukon Education, or if it's extracurricular culture camps or whatnot. you know, I would like to see community programming that's available to all Yukon students, frankly, because in my mind, that's not just First Nations education, that helps with reconciliation between both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Yukoners.
Thank you. Lisa Valenzuela.
Thank you. I'm just taking a note here. I was in Tagish a few days ago, and I met with a grandmother at her door, and she was concerned, and I don't know if she was concerned, but she brought to light that her grandchild wasn't receiving the same level of education in a community as the grandkids' peers were receiving in Whitehorse, and that's shameful. That there wasn't a connection, and so I truly believe that a First Nations school would be helpful in that regard, because education isn't necessarily the same. Like I heard a lot from Melanie about nutrition programs in schools and on the land education and engaging children in ways that really connected them and tied them to lessons that were of value, and it will benefit all children.
Thank you. Brandon Henley.
Again, I think this is a fundamental part of reconciliation, and I know, again, through many conversations, that there is interest in making education more relevant to the needs of First Nation school children, in drawing down education, however that might look, according to the community, the First Nation, or the views of the people, and I think again this is an area where I could help to play that advocacy role and partnership role in supporting education that is close to the values, and that does start to address the unacceptable ongoing gaps in outcomes.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
Carrying on where I left off, the additional supports need to start at the preschool level. We need to recognize that for a lot of kids that they need to have good role models of people that pursued a higher education. There's got to be programs for linking kids up with that. In terms of independent, like First Nations-led school, absolutely. If First Nations are interested in taking over the education in their area, that has to be something that has to be encouraged, because they know better than the other governments what is relevant to their students. And lastly, I would say that the support has to be continuous. It should be starting at the preschool throughout their school years, and then also at the post-secondary level, there should be full access and availability.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
I do see some opportunities for the North in the Conservative Party platform. It speaks to partnering with Indigenous organizations on education and giving each of the territories federal training funds, which would focus on skill shortage areas, and they're looking to increase Indigenous workers and youth in apprenticeships. There are usually dollars for infrastructure coming out of the federal government. I would be happy to push the boundaries on something like this. For example, trades and technical facilities and equipment in communities would be an extraordinary boon for kids who wanted to go in that direction for their career.
Thank you. And for our next question, please outline your policy on electoral reform. And we will start with Lisa Valenzuela. Lisa?
Thank you. I appreciate the question, and we are certainly interested in electoral reform. We haven't been shy about that as the NDP party. And apparently the Liberal Party was also a fan of electoral reform. And unfortunately, and quite honestly, frustratingly and disappointingly, and a broken promise, a huge one, they they platformed and promised that so much in the 2015 election or 2016? I can't remember. They've been in power for 6 years. So 6 years ago, they promised that. They made no effort to move forward with it at all. And quite frankly, I don't know much else to say about that. The NDP have always supported it.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
This will probably be a very short minute for me. That decision was Lisa is correct. It was a promise, and that did not follow through for whatever reason. What I understand is that there was a committee that was struck, and there were some very good. Very good discussion and recommendations. So again, it's not part of the Liberal, it has not appeared again in the Liberal Party platform. But I would continue to be a listener to concerns. It is something I have heard at the doors, and I think if there's nothing that's always off the table, and it could be something to bring back.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
So the Green Party is definitely in favor of electoral reform. For the Green Party and for all of the parties, the small parties, I'm going to say any party other than the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party, they are at a huge disadvantage under our current first past the post voting system, and we would push for a system of proportional representation. There's a lot of good examples of that in the world. Germany is probably the most high profile. Most of the Scandinavian countries, New Zealand, many countries have proportional representations and are doing so successfully. We were massively disappointed in 2015 when Justin Trudeau promised, by some people's count, 180 times that would be the last first past the post election. And yet this is the second first past the post election after that broken promise.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
Electoral reform is not a priority for the Conservative Party at this time.
Thank you. And Jonas Smith.
Thank you. I don't think that it's a coincidence that the parties that consistently have difficulty convincing a plurality of voters to support their policies are the ones who are most vocal about electoral reform. But nonetheless, they represent thousands and thousands and thousands of Canadians who are not happy with our current system. First past the post is easy. The candidate with the most votes wins, and the party with the most successful candidates forms government. And so through that ease of explanation, you get engagement, because people don't have to waste a lot of time understanding the various other models of proportional or whatever else is being proposed. But the reality is, when we look in our world right now, there's a lot of disruption. Things are changing on all levels. Some of that is generational. The baby boomers are aging out, and millennials are taking over as the single largest demographic. People are looking for something different now.
Thank you. And for an opportunity for follow-up, we have 1 moment, and we will start with Brendan Hanley. Brendan?
Yeah, again, I think it's only something that if the people speak, then the people shall be heard, and if it becomes if it is something that comes as a concern, then it would be my responsibility, were I to be successful as MP, to bring that voice. And again, voices from small areas, from northern areas, are really important and need to be heard.
Thank you. Lenore Morris.
I'm going to say that what happened in 2015 and then in 2016 with the disavowal Liberals' campaign promise is, in a way, unfortunately, completely predictable. At the time that that promise was first made, the Liberals were in third place behind the Conservatives and the NDP, and presumably didn't expect to get elected. Once they were elected, they thought, hey, this is a great system. It elected us. It elected us with 39% of the vote and gave us a majority government. So we'd like to take that conflict of interest out. So the proposal by the Green Party is that there be a citizens' assembly for democratic renewal convened so that we sort of hive this off, take it out of the hands of the politicians. The elected politicians have a vested interest in the system that elected them, and they are not looking for renewal, but I think Canadians are.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
I don't have anything to add.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Thank you. So from the last election, some of you will recall that democracy is very important to me. Choice is very important to me. And frankly, that's why I'm sitting in this chair tonight as opposed to a different one. And I think Canadians want something different. They want something better. And I believe they deserve something better. So I think the first place to start is educating people to ensure that they understand the ins and outs and the pros and cons of our current system. I think a big part of that conversation is talking about the role of the Senate and how our country does not necessarily balance proportionate or population with regional representation. But when it comes to the party structure, I am living proof of what happens if you don't toe the party line. So all that to say that I fully support the discussion of electoral reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa Valenzuela.
Thanks, Christine. And for everybody who brought forward these questions from the public, there's a number of ways to implement electoral reform, and it's amazing because most often those governments end up in a minority situation, and so it's no surprise that the Liberals and the Conservatives don't truly support electoral reform, in that every time they're in a minority government, they seem to call elections early, or they lose confidence because they're not working collaboratively in that scenario. And I believe minority government situations in our current way that it's built reflect the most voices of Canadians and those who have elected their officials. And if elected to be Yukon's MP, I truly do believe in electoral reform, and I believe that I will be able to speak for and on behalf of Yukoners in moving forward with electoral reform.
Thank you. And for our last question this evening, I would like again to invite to the podium Regional Chief for Assembly of Yukon First Nations, Klawani Adamak.
Thank you. This question also comes from Chief Bill and myself. And so, of course, as we know, in 2016, the very, very critical and important work of the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls started its work, of course, with the report being released in June of 2019. A key recommendation, of course, out of the 231 calls to justice was the development of both a national action plan, of course, that was recently released. Here regionally, important to note that the Changing the Story to Uphold Dignity and Justice, Yukon's MMIWG 2QIIA 2S Plus strategy was launched. And so in terms of looking to hear from you candidates, firstly, are you familiar with both the National Action Plan and the strategy? And secondarily, how do you or your party commit to advancing this important work, both nationally, but of course regionally, with our regionally led and developed solution for here and by in the Yukon? Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Adamek. And we will begin with Green Party of Canada candidate Lenore Morris. Lenore?
Sorry, I'm going to take a second. So I am familiar with this document. I'm looking at the summary of it here, actually. Obviously, this is really, really important work that was done. There were a large number of people that were involved with this this commission, including a large number of Yukoners, and it's a priority for our party. I am familiar. I know that there's a national action plan. I also know that there is a local commission with respect, a Yukon commission with respect to that, and I would work with that to see that the recommendations are carried out. There's been so much work done. This is a situation where we don't have to keep studying the problem. We've had somebody study it. Let's do it.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
I would echo that. I'm fairly familiar with the report, although certainly not up on every single detail. There is support from the Conservative Party of Canada in implementing recommendations, and I think that a lot of work has been done. A lot of really good work has been done. It's a very, very serious problem and challenge, and we need to work together towards implementing the recommendations.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Yeah, thank you. As a father of two young girls, I can't imagine the pain of losing one of them, yet alone not knowing what happened to them or being dismissed by law enforcement when I'm trying to get answers, and again dismissed because of racism. It makes my skin crawl. So this is a very important issue. So I'd like to start by acknowledging Yukon's leadership on this file. I mean, we've had a number of firsts here. It seems to me we had the first public hearing or whatever it was called here in Whitehorse. And a friend of mine I actually used to work with on another project was a filmmaker, a cameraman, and he was hired locally to shoot that first hearing. And he ended up traveling with it across the country. And I just remember the profound impact it had on him.
Thank you. Lisa Volens-Leduc.
Thank you. I haven't read the whole report. I've read through the calls to justice. Respect for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQ2S plus people must be at the core of the new nation-to-nation relationship. New Democrats acknowledge that respect for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit plus people must be made real by ensuring equitable access and self-determination over land, culture, language, housing, childcare, income security, employment, education, and physical, mental, sexual, and spiritual health. The Conservatives did nothing and refused to address the tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women for almost a decade. And the Liberal government did finally launch a long overdue inquiry, but set it up with a limited mandate and failed to adequately care for.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Thank you. Direct question. Not familiar enough, but of course familiar with the report in general and with the commission, particularly when it was here in Whitehorse, and that was an historic and solemn moment for all of us. To reflect on the actual some of the platform commitments in that vein, there is the commitment to accelerate the implementation of the federal pathway and to accelerate work with partners in the collective and shared priorities of the National Action Plan. So it is critical work. And I have a personal reflection, which maybe I'll say for the next part.
Thank you. And we do have the opportunity for 1-minute follow-up remarks, and we will begin with Lenore Morris. Lenore?
So I had the advantage of looking at the excerpt here, the Yukon section. So in the Yukon, a Yukon advisory committee was formed. There was a very high level of commitment to that. The committee includes a representative of the Government of Canada. And so obviously the Government of Canada is committed to this, has an active ongoing interest in this. The committee has already done great work in terms of coming up with priorities and next steps, and I would do everything that I could to help them carry those out.
Thank you. Barbara Dunlop.
Yeah, I think this, the report and the plan represents another challenge that is faced by Aboriginal people and shows how much work there is to be done. I think we need to work together collaboratively and cooperatively and listen with respect as we look to start implementing the next steps.
Thank you. Jonas Smith.
Thank you. Just to continue, this gentleman I used to work with, he grew up in the Yukon. He'd read the headlines, seen the mural on the side of Staples and whatnot, but hearing those stories firsthand had this enormous effect. The level of trauma, and then not only that, then following the program across the country and seeing the extent of it across the country and the depth and the breadth of the horror, frankly. So I remember him talking about it and how much it changed him. And that's when I remember his words saying, like, reconciliation is a journey for both parties, but it's, the non-Indigenous people that really have to make the movement. So all that to say, I fully support working with Yukon First Nations and all orders of government to ensure this never happens again.
Thank you. Lisa Valens-Leduc.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank you, Chief Adamak and Chief Bill, for the question to start. This is close to my heart. When I was working in youth justice in the custody facility, at one point, all the youth that were there were there as a result of crimes committed against Indigenous women and girls. And it's profound. It's just absolutely profound. And the genocide against Indigenous women in Canada demands action from all Canadians. Until there is justice around this issue, how do we deal with the climate crisis? The Mother Earth is hurting right now. The New Democrats will work in partnership with Indigenous women, the families of the missing and murdered, and communities to implement the inquiry's calls for justice, and the calls to action brought forward by the communities. This includes establishing a plan to address violence against Indigenous women.
Thank you. Brendan Henley.
Yeah, it is about justice and social justice, and that is also a health and a public health issue. And the personal part I was reflecting on and almost returning to, we began with pandemic themes, and one of the unfinished pieces of work out of my office, although a small piece of work, was looking at, in general, prevention of sexualized violence, because there's actually very little literature or work in prevention. And I think that is an important exercise to continue. There is, when we add trauma and the aspects of reconciliation and healing that we need for our Indigenous population, we also need to address our own failings in sexualized violence.
Thank you. And that does conclude our questions for the candidates this evening. I would now like to invite each candidate to offer final remarks of up to 2 minutes each, starting with our independent candidate, Jonas Smith. Jonas?
So thank you again, Christine. We are all Yukoners. So whether your family came over the Ringy Land Bridge, the Chilkoot Pass, or you just moved here last week, this territory is our home, and you deserve a representative in Ottawa that puts your interests first. Now, Yukon First Nations play a central role in the governance of our territory. First Nation governments are decision makers, and their role is constitutionally protected. First Nations have to be involved from the very beginning, and the Indigenous lens needs to be applied on all decisions. Now, many Yukon First Nations are tired of talk and little action from both parties in Ottawa, frankly. Conservatives aren't necessarily happy with the Conservative Party. Liberals aren't necessarily happy with their party right now. Voters of all stripes have had enough of partisanship. It's not working for Yukoners. An example I use is Mr. Bagnall, over the course of multiple election cycles, promised Yukoners that he would fight to let them keep their guns, and then he'd end up in Ottawa and the caucus would crack and he'd find himself voting to take guns away from Yukoners. And even the Conservative Party has now flip-flopped on their firearms position. The reality is there's 338 seats in the House of Commons. Ontario has 121, Quebec has 78, and the Yukon only has one voice. So Eastern Canadians are the ones who decide which party is going to form government. And often that decision is made before the polls even close in the Yukon. So I believe that I can represent all Yukoners, regardless of which party is successful in forming government. And I can work with the government or the opposition as necessary to ensure that the Yukon gets the best possible deal, especially in the case of another minority government, which is rather likely at this point. So as an independent, I can represent you and only you. So I'd like to ask for your support. So thank you again. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. New Democratic Party candidate, Lisa Valenzuela.
I'd like to thank you for the privilege of being invited here today, the Council of Yukon First Nation organizers, Christine, Grand Chief Peter Johnston. As MP, I will always be open to learning from the experiences and voices of Yukon First Nations and Yukoners. I understand the importance of being an ally and a strong advocate, of standing shoulder to shoulder and working together for what's right for the Yukon. I understand the importance of the Chief's place on education and the vision for future generations. A First Nations school must be built. The federal government has a responsibility to help get this school done, and Yukoners can count on Jagmeet Singh and the NDP to work to get that done. Yukon First Nations continue to lead on renewable energy projects. Renewable energy means self-determination, economic development, and action on the climate crisis. I will be an ally to advance this work and promote other Indigenous industries like designers, artists, and those working with fur. In order to not repeat the mistakes of the past, we need to know our history. Since Confederation, Liberal and Conservatives have run this country. The architect of the residential school system was John A. Macdonald, Conservative Prime Minister. The architect of the Indian Act was Alexander Mackenzie, Liberal Party Prime Minister. Can we trust these parties to be allies, to build a better future, to act on reconciliation for future generations? I don't think so. The NDP stood with the land guardians. We stood with residential school survivors demanding accountability. The NDP stood with Indigenous people calling for language recognition. The NDP called out Trudeau's Liberals for twice breaking promises on boil water advisories. This election is an opportunity to work with an ally to take a new path, one of optimism and one of hope. And I truly hope to be the next MP for Yukon.
Thank you. Candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada, Brendan Henley.
Thank you, and I would like, first of all, to give my thanks again to Grand Chief Peter Johnston and to you, Christine, and to CYFN and the organizers for the ability to participate. I think we've had a very interesting discussion and exchange of views, and I'm not only impressed with the depth of the questions and the challenge of providing answers within a 1 minute period, but also I think with the quality of responses from my fellow panelists. So I think we're fortunate to have the quality of candidates that we have, and I really encourage everyone to read everyone's materials and make their choice and make sure that they vote. I think if I am successful, I would look forward to bringing a strong and a critical and an experienced northern voice to the national table, and I would hope to be able to advocate and be a strong advocate for the needs and priorities of Yukoners and make that single voice that Yukon has well heard in Ottawa. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Ganashish, Jonathan. Merci trop. Merci.
Thank you. Candidate for the Green Party of Canada, Lenore Morris.
Thank you to Grand Chief Johnson, to Regional Chief Adamak, to Chief Charlie, Christine, to everybody who's attended and everybody who is watching from home. This has been a really interesting evening for me. I've learned lots. It's fantastic being at a forum like this where there's a lot of engaged, prying, interesting, challenging questions. I hope that people will vote for me on September 20th. I would like to go to Ottawa. I would be a strong voice for Yukoners in Ottawa. I won't be one of 150 or 160 or 170 MPs in the same party all singing the same song. I will be an independent voice if I go there. I'm part of the Green Party of Canada, has a strong progressive platform that I support and that I think would support Yukoners. I can work with any party that's elected. I want to point out that 2 years ago, we elected a minority government. I would say that one of the messages we were sending as voters to the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party and the NDP Party, but especially the Liberal Party, who'd had a majority before that, was we want you to work with the other parties. So that absolutely has not happened. And in fact, after less than 2 years of their 4-year mandate, they sort of gave up and said, we don't want to work with the other parties. Let's have another election. See if we can do better this time. I would work with any of the other parties, but I'd be a voice for Yukoners in Ottawa. I see myself as someone who could keep the government honest. So, merci cho, bonashish, merci, thank you.
Thank you. Candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada, Barbara Dunlop.
Thanks to everyone for sharing and listening tonight. It was a pleasure to hear the points of view expressed so respectfully, particularly where there were differences. As expected, I learned a great deal. We've highlighted some of the challenges we face, but I also heard hope and optimism, particularly when we talk about children and youth. I think we have the motivation and the energy to make communities in the Yukon better for future generations. The Conservative Party platform highlights partnership, respect, and reconciliation. It focuses on working with First Nations and communities to find durable solutions to make real and meaningful impacts in our lives. We will double the Northern Living Allowance, putting money in the pocket of every Yukoner and impacting the economies of all communities in the North. The Conservative Party has a plan to improve housing availability and affordability, to support innovation and community-driven initiatives for mental wellness and addictions, and to begin the overdue work of implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Report. As a Conservative Party Member of Parliament, I can support you with strong allies in Parliament. I can be an influence for Yukon priorities within the federal government. I'd be honored to work with you and to represent you in Ottawa. Thank you.
Thank you. And as we conclude our event this evening, I would like to extend a sincere thank you to the candidates for joining us tonight, and to all those that tuned in to hear from the candidates and gave us your questions. Merci à nous rejoindre ce soir. Thank you very much. In closing, we do have a few quick dates to share about voting in this election. Advance poll dates are September 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th. Polling day is September 20th. You can vote any day leading up to polling day by special ballot, and you can visit www.electionscanada.ca for more information. And now to close the event, I have been asked and am honored to accept to offer a closing prayer. If you will stand, please, and join me. Thank you. Ayat Jan de Si. Ayat Emma Che Kuthat. Quishro Ze Zigli. Sedenish A. Eshni. Eshnishindi Denish Show. Eshnishindi Koshe Show. So ete Eshyandi. So ete Eshyandi. Daye so kosen. Dineye so kosen. Tuye so kosen. Dake so kosen. So kosen e dinat. So ete Eshyandi. Shonithan, thank you. Merci beaucoup. Please drive safely. Take care.